The laughter coming from behind that half-closed door didn't match the rest of the party. Out there, the noise was loud, bubbly, full of clinking glasses and over-rehearsed jokes. But here, in this quiet hallway, it was softer, private, like it wasn't meant for anyone else to hear. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd only come down this way because the main bathroom line was ridiculous, and I'd convinced myself there had to be another one somewhere in the maze of this ridiculous mansion. I kept my head down, moving past darkened rooms and glossy framed photos of people I didn't recognize. Then I heard it again. A low voice. His voice. I froze before I even realized why. Then came hers. My wife's voice. Close. Too close. I told myself it could be nothing. Maybe they were just talking about work. But then I heard her laugh. The one I'd only ever heard when we were alone, and she was trying to get me to forget I was upset about something. It hit me like a sudden drop on a roller coaster. I should have turned around. I should have gone back to the party, to the safety of the crowd and the noise. Instead, I stepped closer. I leaned toward the narrow gap in the door, careful not to let the hinges creak. The warm glow from inside spilled across the hallway floor, catching the edge of my shoes. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that maybe Lila had followed Wallace in here to talk about something urgent, and that this was all a stupid misunderstanding I'd feel embarrassed about later. But something about the tone in their voices made it impossible to walk away. Inside, I could see the corner of a polished mahogany desk and the edge of a leather chair. Wallace's voice was low and smooth, the kind of voice that sounded like it was used to giving orders and getting what it wanted. Lila's voice was softer, almost careful. They weren't just talking. They were talking around something, circling it like two people who both know the truth but aren't ready to say it out loud. Then Wallace laughed, not in that fake party laugh way, but in a way that made my skin crawl. "You didn't have to sneak away," he said. My stomach tightened. Sneak away from what? From who? Lila said something I couldn't fully make out, but I caught pieces. Too risky. He's still here. Later. Her voice was so close I pictured her standing just inches from him, leaning in like she used to with me when we were sharing a secret. I suddenly realized my hands were shaking. I wanted to burst in, to demand an explanation, but instead, I found myself rooted to the spot. My brain was screaming at me to leave before I heard something I couldn't unhear, but my feet wouldn't move. And then there was silence, the kind that swallows the air and makes you feel like the walls are leaning in. I held my breath. That's when I heard footsteps, moving toward the door. The handle shifted just enough to make a faint metallic click, and my pulse jumped so hard I thought I might actually pass out right there in the hallway. I stepped back fast, nearly tripping over the corner of a decorative rug, and pressed myself against the wall like some guilty intruder. The door eased open an inch, then another, but instead of Lila or Wallace stepping out, the gap froze. I could hear them murmuring inside, voices low and tense now, the warmth in their tone from before completely gone. I couldn't make out the words, but I caught the cadence, sharp, urgent, like they were suddenly on the clock for something. I don't know why I didn't leave. Every instinct told me to go, to just vanish before I got caught eavesdropping. But my curiosity had already dug its claws in, and the quiet now felt worse than the laughter I'd heard earlier. I shifted to the side, craning my neck just enough to get a sliver of a view through the opening. Lila's back was to me, her hair spilling over one shoulder, and she was standing close, too close, to Wallace. He wasn't smiling anymore. His hand was on the desk, gripping it like he was trying to keep himself from saying something he'd regret. Lila glanced toward the door for just a second, and my chest seized up. If she stepped out and saw me there, this whole thing would blow up in ways I wasn't ready to deal with. But instead, she turned back to him and said something in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. His reply made my stomach twist. If he finds out now, everything falls apart. That was enough to send every paranoid thought in my brain spiraling out of control. If who finds out? And what exactly would fall apart? Were they talking about me? Someone else? Or was this about work? Some big secret deal she hadn't told me about? My hands were clammy, my mouth was dry, and yet I couldn't stop listening, couldn't stop inching forward like a moth drawn to a flame that was going to burn me alive. Then, without warning, the door opened wider, so fast I barely had time to move. I ducked into the nearest darkened side room, my heart hammering so loud I was sure it would give me away. Through the narrow crack of the doorway, I watched Lila step into the hallway, scanning it for something or someone, before heading back toward the party. Wallace stayed behind, leaning against his desk, staring at the floor like a man who'd just been handed bad news. I stayed hidden, trying to decide if I'd just witnessed the start of a scandal or stumbled into something far more dangerous. I stayed in that dark room far longer than I should have, frozen between wanting answers and wanting to disappear entirely. The faint hum of the party drifted down the hall, muffled by the thick carpet and closed doors, and all I could think about was the way Wallace had looked when Lila left, like he was carrying something heavy and dangerous in his head. My mind wouldn't stop playing with possibilities. Was it an affair? A secret at work? Something criminal? Every scenario was worse than the last, and the more I imagined, the more my pulse refused to calm down. Finally, I decided hiding wasn't going to get me anywhere. I needed to know, and I needed to know now. The longer I stood there, the more it felt like whatever they were talking about was slipping further out of my reach. I waited another moment to be sure Lila was gone, then stepped back into the hallway and moved toward the study. The door was still ajar. Wallace was at his desk, rubbing his temples with one hand while scrolling through something on his phone with the other. His expression was tight, his jaw set in a way that made him look almost cornered. I told myself I'd just walk by, see if I could catch a stray word, and keep going. But as I passed, I heard my name, clear as day. That stopped me cold. I turned slightly, just enough to see his face, and he looked up like he'd felt me there. Our eyes locked for a split second, and his expression shifted into something I couldn't read. It wasn't surprise, and it wasn't anger. It was more like a warning. He stood up slowly, slid his phone into his pocket, and said, "Looking for the bathroom?" His voice was calm, almost casual, but there was something under it, something I couldn't shake. I nodded, muttered something about getting lost, and forced myself to keep moving, even though every instinct screamed at me to press him for answers. As I made my way back toward the main room, I spotted Lila across the crowd. She was laughing with a group of people, a champagne flute in her hand, looking like nothing in the world could bother her. But when her eyes met mine for just a moment, there was a flicker, quick, subtle, gone before I could name it. Guilt? Fear? I don't know. All I know is that the rest of the night, she avoided me, and I avoided her. And by the time we finally left, my head was a mess of unanswered questions, each one worse than the last. When we got home, she went straight to the shower without saying a word, and I sat in the dark living room replaying every sound, every glance, every moment from that hallway. I knew I should let it go, but the truth was already in my head, whispering that I'd only seen the tip of something much bigger and much uglier than I wanted to believe. And I was going to find out what it was, no matter what it cost me. I didn't sleep that night, not even close. Lila came out of the shower smelling like expensive shampoo, slid into bed without looking at me, and within minutes her breathing was slow and steady. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every second from that hallway over and over like a loop I couldn't shut off. The way Wallace had said my name, the way Lila had glanced toward the door as if she'd heard something she didn't want me to hear. It was all there, rattling around in my skull, refusing to settle. Eventually, I gave up on sleep entirely, got out of bed, and went to the kitchen. That's when I noticed her purse on the counter. Normally, she left it in the hallway by the coat rack, but tonight it was here, half-zipped, as if she'd dropped it in a hurry. I stood there staring at it, debating with myself like a criminal about to cross a line he couldn't uncross. My better judgment was shouting at me to leave it alone, but something else, something darker, was telling me that whatever was going on, this was my chance to get ahead of it. My hands were sweating as I opened it. Inside, it was the usual clutter, a wallet, makeup, gum, keys. But tucked into a side pocket was a folded piece of paper, crumpled like it had been handled more than once. I pulled it out and unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a receipt. From earlier that afternoon. For a hotel room. 2 hours. Paid in cash. My stomach dropped so hard I actually had to steady myself on the counter. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was for someone else. Maybe it was for a meeting. But even as the thoughts formed, I could feel how thin they were. My first instinct was to wake her up and demand the truth, but I knew she'd just deny everything, and then she'd be more careful. No, if I wanted answers, I needed to be smart. I needed to wait, watch, and catch her in the middle of it. The next day, I acted like nothing was wrong. I made coffee, kissed her goodbye, even asked about her day like I always did. She was warm, relaxed, almost glowing. That alone made my skin crawl. As soon as she left for work, I got in my car and followed at a distance. I didn't have a plan beyond seeing where she actually went. At first, everything seemed normal. She drove toward the city, headed to her office just like she always did. But halfway there, she took a turn she never took. I slowed down, keeping 2 cars between us, and watched her pull into an underground parking garage I didn't recognize. I waited a minute, then slipped in after her, parking far away. I saw her step out of her car, check her phone, and then walk toward the elevator. She wasn't wearing her work ID badge, and her heels clicked fast, like she was in a hurry. I followed on foot, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice me. The elevator doors closed before I got close enough to see the floor she pressed. I waited for the next one, my heart pounding so hard it was making me lightheaded. When the doors finally opened on the 3rd floor, I stepped out into a quiet hallway lined with frosted glass doors. And there, halfway down the hall, was Lila, standing in front of one of those doors, knocking lightly before slipping inside. The name on the glass wasn't a company I recognized, but it was what I saw through that glass, just for a fraction of a second, that made my whole body go cold. Wallace was in there. I stood there, half hidden in the hallway, staring through that blurred glass like a man trying to make sense of a mirage. Wallace was definitely inside. I could see his silhouette, broad-shouldered, moving with that same deliberate confidence he carried at the party. Lila was closer to him than I wanted to admit, her head tilted just slightly, listening. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way their bodies angled toward each other was enough to keep my blood boiling. It wasn't just proximity, it was familiarity. They were comfortable together, too comfortable for my liking. The hallway was quiet except for the faint hum of air conditioning, and the stillness made me painfully aware that I was alone here. Anyone walking past might notice me just standing there like some lunatic. I looked around for anything that could give me a clue about where I was, some sign, a company logo, a list of offices, but there was nothing. The walls were blank, the glass unmarked except for the faint etched line where the name might have once been. It was as if this place didn't want to be found. I edged closer, each step slow, careful. My plan was to get close enough to maybe catch a few words without drawing attention. But as I moved, the door suddenly opened, and a man I'd never seen before stepped out. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit, and he looked at me in a way that made my skin crawl. Sharp eyes, calculating, like he'd already decided I didn't belong here. He didn't say anything, just adjusted his cufflinks and walked past me toward the elevator. The moment he was gone, I pressed my ear to the glass. What I heard wasn't what I expected. Lila's voice was tight, almost pleading. But if it goes wrong, it's on both of us. Wallace's reply was low and measured. That's why we need to move quickly. No more delays. Move quickly? No more delays. This didn't sound like lovers sneaking around. This sounded like something else. A deal? A scheme? Something they weren't supposed to be doing. My stomach churned as I realized I might be in the middle of something bigger than I understood, something I might wish I'd never learned about. I pulled back just as the door opened again. This time, Lila stepped out. She froze when she saw me, her eyes wide, and for a second neither of us said a word. Then she forced a smile that didn't touch her eyes and asked, "What are you doing here?" Her voice was casual, but her body was tense, like she was ready to block me from going inside. I lied without thinking. I was in the area, thought I'd surprise you for lunch. I expected her to relax, but instead she just nodded quickly and said, "Not today, Vernon. I'm busy. We'll talk later." Then she walked away, heels clicking, never looking back. I glanced toward the open doorway, considering stepping inside, but Wallace was already there, standing just far enough back in the shadows that I couldn't read his expression. He didn't say a word. He just slowly closed the door, leaving me alone in that silent hallway with 100 questions and no good answers. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what I'd find or of being right about what I already suspected. I left that building with my mind buzzing like an overloaded circuit. The image of Lila's face burned into my brain. It wasn't guilt I'd seen in her eyes. It was something colder, sharper, like she was calculating the exact amount of truth she could give me without giving me anything at all. I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, not ready to go home, not ready to be alone with the thoughts that had started to take root. Every scenario my brain conjured only left me with more questions, but one thing was clear: Wallace and Lila weren't just sneaking around for something physical. This felt orchestrated, like there was a plan, and I was the one person not supposed to know about it. That night, after Lila had gone to bed early claiming she had a headache, I sat in the living room with my laptop and started digging. I searched for the address of that building, scrolling through business listings, looking for anything familiar. There was no office for Wallace's company there. In fact, most of the spaces in that building weren't listed at all, which was strange in itself. I finally found a scrap of information buried in a real estate database. 3 floors leased under a generic holding company with no website, no contact info, nothing. It was like chasing a shadow. I was about to give up when something caught my eye. In an old press release from a few years back, that holding company had been mentioned in connection with a controversial acquisition, a deal that was quietly shut down after an investigation into financial misconduct. One of the names tied to it, Wallace. And, buried in the same article, another name that made my blood run cold, Lila's maiden name. I sat there staring at the screen, the pieces starting to shift in my mind like a puzzle I didn't want to finish. They'd known each other before she even worked for him. They'd been connected long before I ever met Wallace at the company holiday party. And if that was true, then half of what I believed about my marriage might already be a lie. The thought made me physically ill, but instead of confronting her, I did something worse. I decided to keep digging. I pulled up her email on our shared tablet, something I'd never done before. Most of it was mundane: work updates, sale receipts, spam. But then I found a chain of messages between her and Wallace, coded in vague language about progress and deadlines, referencing dates that didn't line up with anything at her job. There was even one from last week where she'd written, "Once we're past this, everything will settle down." Settle down from what? The more I read, the more I realized this wasn't about romance. It was about whatever they were building together, something they were hiding from almost everyone. And from the tone of the emails, it was about to reach some kind of breaking point. I closed the tablet just as I heard footsteps in the hallway. Lila appeared in the doorway, her hair messy, eyes half asleep, and asked what I was doing still up. I forced a smile, told her I couldn't sleep, and she gave me this long, searching look before nodding and going back to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew I was getting closer, and that she might already be planning what to do about it. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of determination I hadn't felt in years. I was tired of circling shadows, tired of replaying hallway whispers and guessing at meanings. If I was going to get answers, I was going to get them from the source. I waited until Lila was dressed for work, standing in front of the mirror adjusting her earrings, before I said it, calmly, without accusation. "I know you and Wallace have been meeting outside the office. I've seen you. I've heard things. I just need to know the truth." For a second, she froze. Her hand stopped midair, the earring half in place, and she just looked at me through the mirror. I braced myself for the storm: anger, denial, maybe even tears. But instead, she set the earring down, turned to face me fully, and said, "You're right. I should have told you sooner." What came next wasn't at all what I'd imagined in those sleepless nights. Lila explained that the secret meetings, the cryptic emails, even the hotel receipt, were all part of a confidential project she'd been helping Wallace with, one she'd been sworn not to discuss until the deal was finalized. Wallace was trying to buy out a failing nonprofit that rescued and rehabbed historic buildings across the state. The project had been tangled in messy legal disputes and bad press because of the previous owner's shady financial history, the very scandal I'd read about in my late-night research. Lila had been brought in because she had the connections and the negotiation skills to help salvage it without drawing more unwanted attention. The "no more delays" I'd overheard? It wasn't about sneaking around. It was about securing the funding before the property developers could bulldoze the main building and erase over a century of history. The hotel receipt? It had been a last-minute meeting with an out-of-town donor who didn't want to be seen visiting Wallace's office until the deal was safe. I felt something uncoil in my chest that had been wound tight for weeks. Relief, yes, but also shame. Shame for how quickly I'd let suspicion take over, for how easily I'd assumed the worst. Lila saw it in my face, stepped closer, and took my hand. "You've always been the one I can trust, Vernon," she said softly. That's why I hated keeping this from you. But I promised. By the end of the month, the deal went through. The building was saved, the nonprofit was restructured, and Wallace publicly thanked Lila for her invaluable help, giving her credit in front of a room full of people. I sat in the audience, clapping until my hands hurt, realizing that for all my doubts and late-night paranoia, she'd been working for something bigger than both of us. We drove home that night with the windows down, the summer air warm on our faces. For the first time in a long time, the silence between us felt easy, not the heavy, unspoken kind, but the comfortable kind that comes when everything's been said and you know you're on the same side. And as much as I hated to admit it, I was glad I hadn't just walked away from that half-closed door at the party. Because chasing the truth, as messy as it had been, had brought me right back to her.